لا تأسفن على الدنيا وما فيها فالموت لا شك يفنينا ويفنيها ومن يكن همه الدنيا ليجمعها فسوف يوما على رغم يخليها لا تشبع النفس من دنيا تجمعها.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm really excited for today's podcast. I'm presenting on behalf of Islamic Literary Society. So the Islamic Literary Society was founded in 2019 with the aim of promoting, fostering and developing the heightened appreciation of authors and literary works of classical and contemporary scholarship. This is accomplished by ways of reading books and launches, talks published by authors, and also having podcasts with speakers that we have today as well, inshallah. This is also critical reviews and events. And the aim is to encourage a revival of Islamic readership in our day-to-day lives and to increase literary awareness among various members and the general public. So for more information, you can jump onto the website of IslamicLiterarySociety.com. And we're hoping as well that we have younger viewers listening and hoping to inspire them too. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our dear sister in Islam, Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan, Suhaiymah, sorry. And she is an author of an educator, award-winning performance poet and published writer from Leeds. She is the author of a poetry collection, Postcolonial Banter, co-author of anthology, A Girl Flies Guide to University, Being a Woman of Colour at Cambridge and Other Institutions of Power and Elitism. She is a co-essayist in I Refuse to Condemn, Resisting Racism in Times of National Security, and is a host of a podcast known as Breaking Boundaries. Along with all of this, her work is focused on disrupting the common understanding of history, race, constructions, and knowledge and power, particularly interrogating the purpose of narratives about Muslims, gender, and violence. She is also published in The Guardian, Al Jazeera, Gaudem, and her spoken word performances have millions of views online, so you can follow those and have a look on YouTube in your own time. Suhaiymah is currently a visiting fellow at Queen Mary University of London, and her poetry, articles, and books can be found on the university school syllabi. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you, sister. Jazakallah khair for giving us your time. And my dear sister in Islam, I'd like to start off by asking you a few questions, if that's okay. So, firstly, my question is, what inspired you to become a word poet?
Firstly, Assalamu alaikum. Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me and thank you for hosting this interview. And hello to everyone who's viewing. Assalamu alaikum to you as well. Yeah, so it's a good question. What inspired me to become a spoken word poet? And the honest answer is there was no singular event. It's not like I, saw something or somebody said to me, or there's no one event that happened in my life. But I actually didn't find poetry very interesting as I was growing up. I remember studying poetry at like English GCSE and even A-level, and kind of found it a bit boring, didn't really get what it was all about. It sort of seems to be by people that I didn't really know anything about them, and the things they're writing about weren't particularly interesting to me. But what I was always interested in at the same time was on YouTube watching slam poetry, which is very much rooted in like the American and particularly African American tradition of hip hop and rap, and slam comes out of that, and it's very political, and it's very much about power and race. And so this was always really interesting to me. Of course, I didn't think it was something I would ever do or could do. And I think that's important because later in my life, when I was studying at university, I was really struggling, actually. My mental health wasn't very good. And I went to see somebody at the university, the college nurse, and she said to me, what is something that you have always wanted to do, but that you didn't think that you could ever do? So I said to her, well, look, I like watching these videos of people kind of performing these spoken word pieces. But I can't do that. That's just, I'm not that confident. I couldn't stand in front of an audience and do this kind of thing. It's not me. And she said, that's exactly what we're going to do. So she was the one actually who signed me up to my first ever spoken word performance slam. It was just a university event. And I didn't tell any of my friends, I didn't tell anybody. I just went in secret, wrote my poem in secret. And it was only when I was performing it that I realized something was happening. And it was that I felt able to speak in a way that I hadn't been able to speak before. But I also realized that people were really responding well to what I was saying. Alhamdulillah, people were really listening and taking it into account. And after that, it kind of works so that people judge your work. So you kind of get judged, and the top three people, kind of get ranked. But if you come first, you get to perform at the next event, right? So there's a sort of this incentive to keep going. And as I started to kind of get more and more known in that small circle, I ended up being on the university slam team. So that's where you're kind of performing on behalf of the university with other people. That was really fun. But I never anticipated kind of becoming a poet, right? That wasn't something, that was just something, it was like a hobby. And so it's only when I was studying later on in London that I signed up to be part of a national slam. So this was now people from all around the country. Again, it was inspired by, a friend of mine said, oh, you live close by to this thing, you should apply. And it's only when I really, really, really got to the final of that and that I performed and I came second, and then the video from that went viral, that things changed, because people presumed that I had more poems where that came from, right? They presumed that, oh, she must be a poet, she must do this. So I sort of honestly just rolled along with that. And I kind of, when people said, do you want to come and perform? Do you have more poems that you would like to perform? I thought, okay, yeah, because I felt that the message that I was sharing was important, because the way that people had responded to that poem specifically, the one in the slam, kind of proved to me that it was important as a Muslim to disrupt the kind of notions that I think oppress a lot of us and hold us back from saying what we really feel, and also to speak the truth to power, right? That's what we're supposed to do as Muslims. And so I found spoken word poetry a way to do that. And, the more that I've grown and understood, the more I know now as well that poetry is obviously such a rich and integral part of Islamic tradition, and that, so many of the Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ were poets, and they really were spoken word poets as well, right? It was this performance element. It was this speaking, almost like rap battles, right? They were using poetry to fight, and so that excites me as well, and it makes me think that maybe Allah has placed a certain barakah within the speech that is poetry. I think there's something in poetry that when we hear it, we feel differently than we do with other speech. So I continue to be inspired by other poets and kind of by just the miracle that is language, I suppose. But yeah, it was never kind of one thing become a poet. Alhamdulillah, it's obviously Allah's plan for me, because I had a completely different plan for myself, and I just ended up doing this.
So just going back a little bit, you mentioned about someone, kind of inspiring you to that journey and taking that journey. And one aspect is, and I want to ask you this question, is how do we at times we can find that, especially Muslim women, there is an issue of kind of confidence boosting and building, and sometimes there's an imposter syndrome that comes, whether they have, and even though, mashallah, many of them have many skills and accreditation and lots of things that reflect that they are worthy of particular types of things, they just don't feel that confident. What would you say to them about kind of pushing boundaries?
Well, the thing I always say is that, I don't think it's us that are lacking confidence, as you said. I don't think it's Muslim women that are imposters, right? I think the feeling itself is because of the context that we're in. So I would always remind anybody who feels that way that, first off, it's not your fault that you feel this way, right? We live in all these institutions which are, we know, structurally racist, structurally sexist. And we know that if you're a Muslim woman, and specifically if you're a visibly Muslim woman, if you wear hijab or niqab, that you're being viewed through all these different lenses. There's all these ideas and assumptions about who you are. And it's those that I feel become this fog, that become this mist on top of you, that makes it really hard to break through. And so I don't feel that, any of us have anything we have to do to kind of push forward or break through. But I feel that if we recognize, oh, this isn't coming from inside me, I'm not the one at fault. I'm not the one kind of doing something wrong and needing to do more. For me, that in of itself is quite reassuring. And that for me was something that enabled me to think, I don't need to change at all. It's the world that needs to change. And speaking about that in of itself really helped me. So I would always just remind people, I think I don't know any shy Muslim women, if I'm honest. Like, I think most Muslim women, when they're in spaces that are safe, when we're in spaces where we know that we're not being judged, we're loud or we're funny. I always say, I want to see more Muslim women comedians because Muslim women are the funniest people that I have ever met. But, because of the way that we're perceived, people don't give us those platforms. And so I think it's a matter of kind of making the spaces that we feel safe in. And when we're not in those spaces, where we know we're in spaces where we're being judged or perceived or kind of even just forced to perform in certain ways to prove that we're clever or to prove that we're independent or any of these other things that we're kind of asked to prove all the time, just reminding ourselves that we don't have anything to prove. We don't have to prove those things. All we have to prove is ourselves to Allah. And that's really liberating, I think. And it kind of takes some of that pressure off. So yeah, I think it's not easy, but I think that reframing helps me.
Great. Okay. So moving on, I know you've kind of told us about the journey that led you to this path, but I'm also interested in kind of like your academic journey, how you came about going to the University of Cambridge and SOAS, and a little bit about that, and why you took particular steps. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm from Leeds. My grandparents were migrants from Pakistan to Bradford. That's a very traditional British story, basically. And I grew up in Leeds, went to a state school, the local state school. And, really, I didn't even know that you had to apply to university, right? I thought some people go, some people don't, didn't really know what the process was about. And it's only when I got to, sixth form, A level, where, we were learning this process that it then occurred to me. And we, alhamdulillah, we were just really blessed that there was a college in Cambridge that had access to, they do a lot of outreach work with like state schools. So this woman came to my school and, spoke to us. And I was really surprised because she seemed kind of normal. And I was just like, oh, I didn't know that like you could be normal and like go to Cambridge. That's really weird. And, she was talking about how much she loved history. And I was like, well, I love history. And she was saying that, she didn't have to know Latin and she didn't have to, play the clarinet and she didn't have to do any of these things that I kind of presumed you have to do to go to Oxford and Cambridge. So that kind of piqued my interest and I was like, okay, maybe this is something that even I could do. And a little while later, I was also blessed in that that same kind of scheme, they offered two students from our school to go on a residential, I suppose, to Cambridge, and you had to be interested in history. So again, as I say, I was really into history, and again, that's actually thanks to having a brilliant history teacher at school. So I went on this trip, and because it was all people from Leeds schools, I think it was really important that made me kind of think, oh, everyone here is just somebody that I could know, somebody they don't seem super posh, they don't seem super anything that much different to what I am. And I noticed in the conversations and stuff that we had, it wasn't like, oh my goodness, everything I'm saying is so stupid, or, I don't know anything about history and these people know so much. And in fact, what I found was that what the people who were leading the residential were more interested in was not what we knew or the facts that we knew or I thought it was going to be what events do you know, what kings and queens do you know, but they were more interested in what questions do you ask? How, do you treat history as a kind of investigation? Are you interested in finding out things? And I very much was. I actually was desperate to know more things. So it was those experiences that kind of inspired me to think, yeah, okay, I'm going to make this application. And my teacher's obviously really encouraging. The school didn't really know like what the interview process or any of that would be like. So they actually gave me a really hard practice interview because we thought it was going to be really, really super hard. But the real interview was actually quite a lot easier than that. The real interview was sort of, two different interviews. One where they were just asking me, these are the things you've said in your personal statement. You've said these things about yourself. You like these things. You're interested in these questions. And they weren't testing me about history. Like I say, again, they were just asking, why do you think this happened? Or what might have contributed to this thing? And why are you interested in the past? So that was really what led me there. And then, alhamdulillah, obviously, I'm blessed in that I benefit from the exam system. I can do that system. I know a lot of people who really hate that exam schooling system. I don't think the education system we have is really beneficial for many people, but I did benefit from that. And for that reason, I was able to get into Cambridge. And I mean, that's a whole other story because Cambridge was a really mixed experience. I think.
I was going to ask
yeah.
how you got on at Cambridge. I mean, I went to the University of Nottingham and predominantly, I think I was the only Asian in my class in sociology when I did my undergraduate. And that was quite an experience for me. coming from a very much inner city experience and going to a community school. And I was going to ask you about that, and I also was going to ask about whether you felt going to Cambridge it altered things in terms of social mobility and social capital, increasing it in to some extent, but also and I've done some reports with regards to accessing higher education, Muslim women accessing them, and some of the barriers that they face. So I'd like to just hear a little bit more, just for myself. I know there'll be other people listening in, but about your experience with that. Is okay? Yeah.
Yeah. Feel free to ask me anything specific if I'm sort of going in a boring direction.
No
But
worries.
broadly speaking, look, you mentioned in my bio, I've written a book with a couple of friends that's called A Fly Girl's Guide to University, and it's about being women of color at Cambridge.
Yeah.
Now, what I would say, if I can try and put it in a nutshell, is that I arrived at Cambridge with this belief that, everyone I meet here is going to be, these are the cleverest people in the country. They are going to be super, just really interested in their subjects, really critical thinkers. And immediately, what I really came to find was that the majority of people were from private schools. It wasn't that they were super clever, it was that their parents had had the wealth to pay for them to have these brilliant educations. So that was the first thing that was like, oh, and I realized that actually there was like the only one or two other people I could find in my college who went to, a normal state school like I did. So that was the first thing. And the second thing was obviously that, as you say, similar to your experience, I was the only visibly Muslim woman in my entire college, my entire course, a history course across the entire university. But again, even, as just a brown person, as an Asian, there was like a handful of brown people in my college and again on my course. So what happened was, really early on, I became, I suppose, this idea of what other people thought I was, right? So people would ask me, oh, what do you think about Palestine? What do you think about Charlie Hebdo? What do you think? I was just the Muslim. And that was a really weird experience, right? Because I had been at school in Leeds where, there's so many Muslims, so many Asians, no one could ever be like, oh, that Muslim girl and be referring to me because you can mix me up with so many people. But here I was just that. And so it took me a while to understand what was going on because at first I was just like, we need to get more people to apply here. That's what's happening. Is just not enough people are applying. There's something going wrong here. But what I really realized over time, I think being there, and when I met other women of color specifically, so there was a group called Fly, which was specifically for, it was made by Black women, and then they opened up to just like any woman of color. And when we talked, I was always so reassured because they would say things, and I think, oh, I'm not imagining it, I'm not making it up. Like this is actually happening, right? I'm not sort of just imagining that people treat me in this way. It's real. But more than that, realizing that this wasn't just sort of personal prejudice or bias, but that there's something going on historically here, structurally, that meant that it was always going to be harder for Black and brown people, always going to be harder for them to access this knowledge and these resources, but also that the knowledge and resources we were accessing, so I was studying history, right? But hang on, whose history was I studying? What history was I studying? And I became very aware because I wanted to do my dissertation about my grandma's experience, basically. So about the experience of Pakistani women who'd come to the UK between the 1960s and 1980s. And, you can go to the National Archives, you can go to the local archives, but you're not going to find anything, by these women, but even about them, it's just by, anthropologists and these kind of people with very racist ideas. So all that they write is these women they don't know how to be good mothers, they're unhygienic, they are, they don't leave the houses, they're uneducated and they're oppressed. And, these are tropes that I know so well. And I know we know them not to be true, right? Because we know these women, we know people. So I said, I want to do an oral history. I want to interview people. And this made me think as well about how, what we consider to be evidence is really ideologically formed by the power structures around us. What we consider to be a legitimate source of knowledge is really structured by who has had the privilege of speaking for all these years. So it became very obvious to me that colonialism was sort of the thing that ideologically shaped Cambridge as an institution, but also financially, right? Like so many of the buildings themselves come from money that came from not just colonialism, but also, the money of people who made wealth by owning slaves, enslaving people, by owning the plantations that people who were enslaved had to work on. So all of that, I'm mentioning all of that because these were things I began to realize in that time. In an ironic way, I think you asked like how going there changed me. I think it's two very contradiction. Going to Cambridge really politicized me accidentally, right? It made me really aware that, oh my goodness, like racism is a huge issue, and it's not just bias, it's structural and it's historical. And I think if I'd gone to a university where there were more people like me, I wouldn't necessarily have had to think about that or face it as clearly. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, if I go anywhere with my Cambridge degree, it's like I have likened it before to a police badge, right? It's forged in a really violent institution, a really problematic institution. As soon as people see it, they give you access to stuff. They think, oh, you have a right to this stuff. It gives you entitlement. And so I think it's a really dangerous thing, because I think if you get through one of those institutions with a degree, I think you really have a responsibility to actually talk about the kind of violence that was forged in, and to talk about the kind of nature of those spaces, and also to remind people that, hey, I always say, most of the cleverest people I know would never, ever have been able to get into Cambridge. So it's not about who's clever. It's about who can speak in the right ways, who can dress in the right ways, who knows the right people, right? Who do you network with? And so, I think it did give me social capital in the sense that I think it would be easier for me to become like a corporate lawyer or, an MP or whatever else. I mean, I don't really want to be any of those things, but I think if I wanted to be, I would have a much easier stepping stone, because simply by virtue of knowing these people, right? Like all the people that I know that I was friends with, many of them work in civil service, many of them kind of going into that political sphere or kind of that financial sphere. And again, I'm not interested in either of those, but I think you can see that actually the elite, the kind of people who shape many of the decisions that build our world, are just people who had wealthy parents that could send them to these places where they got to meet each other and give each other good jobs. So yeah, it made me very disillusioned with the world. But at the same time, it makes people think that I'm clever in some way, or that I have something interesting to say. And so I try to just make sure that, inshallah, I kind of am responsible to that. But it is definitely, yeah, it's a very interesting thing to see the effect of just saying that you have a degree from Cambridge. People put so much respect on that they shouldn't. They really shouldn't. So yeah.
It's so important as well in terms of colonialism and teaching that as a kind of concept within schooling environments. So there's a lot of work from the running media doing our migration story. So with that as well, it gets people to start questioning and thinking. And I think for many of us, that journey started when we got to university and we started to think critically, and it opened up lots of questions. Great. Okay. So really interested to learn about how you set up the Brown Hijabi blog, and that might have happened in this sort of environment where you are having these questions. Yeah,
exactly. Bang on. Yeah, I think, as I say, I was feeling all these different things. I was sort of trying to process lots of thoughts, and initially I actually called it the Brown Hijabi. It was kind of tongue in cheek, because I was the only brown hijabi. So I was kind of like, it's anonymous, but everyone's going to know it's me. And it's just because I wanted to kind of process and think through what I was experiencing. So lots of the early blog posts, I mean, they're still on the blog, are really me kind of thinking through, I went to this event and this thing was said and I didn't feel right about it, but I couldn't figure out why. And I'm just trying to figure out what was going on in lots of scenarios, or lots of the kind of traditions that they had, the formal dinners and the kind of lots of bowing and all these weird traditions, and me trying to figure out, why do we have these, who benefits and why should we conform to these? So it came from that context, yeah. And, alhamdulillah that it did, because it was really cathartic for me. I think that's when I learned, actually, it was just before I set that up, Fly, that I mentioned, that group for women of color, we created our own blog, right? And what happened was that I loved the process of writing so much that I was just like, I should just create my own blog, because otherwise I'm going to be writing every article. So it was partly that. It was that writing for me was also something that was just, it really helped me, and it still does to this day, helps me to figure out the root cause of why I'm feeling something. I think sometimes I don't know about other people, I don't know about yourself, but I'm not very good at figuring out why I feel things sometimes. I might just feel really upset, and I don't know exactly why. But when I write, I can kind of ask, why are you feeling that way? Okay, what happened? And I can dig into things deeply. And when I do that, there's something that I think it helps me to understand. And like we said earlier about, when you asked about confidence and imposter syndrome, helps me to understand that lots of the things I feel are not due to me having some deficiency or being kind of stupid or kind of unable to understand things, but it comes from these lots of external contexts and history. So yeah, that's the context of the Brown Hijabi, really. It's just I guess a young person trying to figure out their way through the world that they're in.
Processing emotions and feelings. And I think for the younger audience listening, it's really important. I think there's been a move towards a lot of people doing journaling and writing down how they feel, and processing that has been a really helpful experience. And almost in a lot of ways, when you're asking particular philosophical questions as well, it becomes a way of kind of a way of reflecting and looking at things through and processing them through writing. So I have
Definitely.
a question that I want to ask, because just going back a little bit, I know I keep going back and forth, but you said, and you mentioned about not necessarily going down a particular route, so be it MPs, and having particular connections and having that social capital. So just, I'm putting you on the spot here, but where do you see like your career path in terms of from a professional point of view?
That's a great question. I'm self-employed, which, is something I never really imagined or understood, even 5 years ago. To be honest with you, I don't buy into the idea of careers, right? Like, I'm just gonna say it. When we look at Islamic figures, let's go with Islamic figures from the past. You can read any of their bios online, right, on Wikipedia or wherever you want to look, and they will say philosopher, jurist, poet, thinker. There'll be so many things at the same time, and I think this sort of individualistic and very neoliberal society we live in now makes us think that we must only pursue one thing for the entirety of our lives, and we must only progress in that one thing. And I think that really goes against the essence of Islam and kind of the pursuit of knowledge, right? And I think if we're put on earth with only one purpose, which is to worship Allah, that can look 100 different ways. And so I feel really blessed that I've never really felt that I need to put myself into a certain box or kind of a certain path. And, when I left university, after I'd done my master's, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I've always loved what I realized kind of at the base of everything that I do. Yes, I'm a poet, yes, I'm a writer, I kind of do these talking events, all these different things. But the thing that I love that kind of, I think, ties them all together, I just love to share ideas with people and learn from other people and kind of think through, like, here's a way that I've been thinking about things. Does that help you? Oh, yes, actually, when you say it like that, that helps me. And that process, that communication is learning, it's education. And so, I was always, I think, interested in going to education in some way or another. Like, maybe I would have become a teacher in one life, or maybe I could have, there's many different ways you can be an educator, right? So I like to think of many of the things that I do within the field of educating others, right? So, alhamdulillah, I do get to give a lot of lectures and that kind of thing and workshops, but also even poetry itself, the kinds of ideas that we share with people, the kind of spaces it actually lets me be in, means that I do feel that I'm able to share ideas with people and also learn from them. So I'd like to think that, inshallah, by the time that, I go back to Allah, that really no one can pigeonhole me, and that actually there's a whole million range of things that I could be seen to have done. And I'm fine with that, because, as I say, we're here to worship Allah, and everything else is just sort of frills and tassels. So, yeah.
And that's the way it should be. It shouldn't be just so static and rigid. So yeah, absolutely. Jazakallah khair. Okay, so another question, looking back now, what would you tell your younger self if you had the opportunity? Like, what would you say to your younger self now?
It's a really good question, isn't it? I guess there's a few things that I would say. One is just like, don't worry. I think this is something classic that everybody says to their younger selves, but I would say, don't worry so much. One, don't worry so much what other people think as well. I think we spend so many years of our lives, I guess, worried how we'll be perceived by different people, so many different types of people as well, right? So I think that's one thing. And the other thing is just, I would really encourage her to, really pursue what you love and pursue it honestly. And what I mean by that is, if you enjoy writing, then write, but don't write what you think people will like. Don't write what you think will be received well or will get published. Write what really matters to you. What's the real truth that you need to share? Because, and I say this in poetry workshops all the time, is that we all think, I don't know what to write, or like, I don't know what's, is this good? Is this not? The truth is, if we all just told our own, the truest story that we can tell, that's the thing that we love about each other. That's the thing that when we're vulnerable in those ways, I think, again, that's a blessing that Allah's given only humans, only we can do that of the creation that we know of on this earth. And I think there's a reason why. And there's something that when you're honest, I feel something. When I'm honest, you feel something. There's something in those interactions. And I think, yeah, I would just really encourage her to, be honest, be true to herself, and not feel the need to pursue things that other people have kind of suggested or said that it's only if you do this that you'll be, able to do X, Y, Z. I think, I think all young people should be encouraged to really trust what they love. Yeah.
So younger and older generations, how would you advise them in terms of going forward in the British context? So when you're living in Britain, some of the obstacles they may face, what would you give as a one piece of advice or takeaway message?
That's a really hard question. So what
Because
advice would I give to anybody?
you answered my question before I'd come to it, so I was like, right, I'll ask you another one. So this is to do with kind of those who want to follow in your footsteps, but also about some of the challenges that we face, and a takeaway message that essentially, I mean, alhamdulillah, a lot of your work is inspirational, and it motivates and it inspires many to be proactive and to do something and make a change. And having these lived experiences that you've had, and you've created a process of reflecting those and then communicating those to mass audiences, what would you say to both younger and older generations who will be listening to this?
I think one thing actually that is really important is not waiting for permission. Now, what I mean by that is lots of people. So I mentor a couple of younger women, and I meet people of different ages, older than me, younger than me, when I do workshops. And one thing I really feel is that a lot of people are waiting for somebody to say to them, you can share this piece of writing with the world, or yes, you can write a poem, or yes, you can try to start that novel that you wanted to write. And I think sometimes that permission we're waiting for is actually only ever going to come from us, and we're the people who need to say to ourselves, yes, we need to trust ourselves. So I think for many of us, the reason that we feel that way is also just because, there are all these judgmental sort of forces within the world, whether that's racism, whether that's sexism, or whether it's, within our own communities. And I think it's important to give yourself that permission to think, I know that I have something to say, and I believe in myself enough to say it. And I promise you that when you share it, when you share what you have to say, at least one other person will read it. And that process is the process of communication. That's the process of dialogue. That's the process of, somebody listening and being seen. And yeah, I think whenever the pieces that I am always most moved to share, whether that's an article I've read online, whether it's a poem, it's a book, whatever it is, it's always where somebody has been really honest. And I know I've just mentioned this, but I think that's the thing. We sometimes don't give permission to ourselves to say what we really want to say. So it's that, and I just want to connect that also to, mention what are some of the obstacles maybe people will face. I think that people think often that obstacles include things like what will publishers deem as like publishable, what will critics think, and these kinds of things. But I think because we start thinking like that, we actually limit our writing, and we actually try to write like other people, and that's actually such a huge mistake, because as soon as you start trying to emulate how somebody else writes, you're losing the voice of yours that made you unique, that made your writing something special to you. And we all have that voice, but we all, we learn through school, we learn through university, we learn through reading other people's books or whatever else to really trim and limit that. And so, I myself, I do it all the time. I'll write things and I just think, oh, it's not me. What am I saying? Like, this doesn't feel like my voice. And it's every now and then your own voice comes through and you think, oh, that's her. There she is. That's the writing that I was waiting for. And I think, yeah, that's, I really do feel like, there's so many pressures on Muslims to conform, to kind of, be good Muslims, right? Like, show them that you're normal, show them that you're funny, that you can kind of do all the things that they can do. And you can, yes, you pray, but you don't make a big deal about it. Yes, you fast in Ramadan, but you don't make a big deal. And I think because we're told to really shrink our Islam, to shrink our Muslimness, to, we associate ourselves, our Muslimness, with threat. We think, oh my gosh, I pray in the conversation, someone will probably think I'm going to blow it up. All those thoughts that we have, we're policing ourselves and we're really limiting, our own abilities. And so that's also linked to that thing of giving ourselves the permission to, really embrace what it is that we really believe. And if we really want to be Muslim, we really want to pursue that relationship with Allah, then let's be unafraid about that. Let's kind of give ourselves permission to do that. And when we give permission to ourselves to do that, that I think affects all the other parts of our lives. We then give permission to ourselves to, pursue whatever it is that we love. So, I'm still growing and learning as well, though. So I think, many of these things that I'm saying, they're things that I'm trying to figure out too. And I think that there's also that part of it that just, I think for all of us, wherever and whatever age we're at, wherever we're at in our lives, that, I think being always open to learning from other people and always open to growing is useful. And, every day I'm endlessly surprised by the ways that I change my mind about things because of listening to somebody else's experiences. So I think, inshallah, Allah keeps us all humble and kind of able to do that, because I think it does scare me that, that we ever become hardened in our thoughts or kind of so firm in what we think about the world that we, lose sight of actually we might be wrong. We might not have it.
There's also the fact that we're having to play this normalization that you've mentioned of what it is to be a normal Muslim, and actually just being human and showing our faith in itself speaks volumes. And people ask questions and sometimes we're offended by that and others aren't, and I think it's a good way, like what you've mentioned throughout our podcast today is the kind of usefulness of dialogue and debate and discussion, and these lived experiences where people come together and start to talk, which is really important. So obviously we're living now in a very precarious time with COVID, and we've noticed that since in terms of 8 years, there's been a huge surge in selling of books. So we've had about over 200 million print books actually ordered. Wow. And it's increasing. So we've seen that reported in the news recently. So moving on now, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about kind of your own work and telling us a little bit about your book on Postcolonial Banter. And one of the purposes of ILS is trying to encourage people to start reading and start to kind of get together and have critical thinking. So yeah, if you could let us know a little about your book, but also advice you'd give to people who are just kind of maybe new to reading, who are busy, don't necessarily have a lot of time, but are starting this journey of trying to engage with various different types of literature, be it fiction or non-fiction.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I think that's awesome. I mean, I'll start off by saying, I struggle to read. I struggle to read myself. And I think during these times particularly, it's hard to pick up a big book, right, and find the time for it. This is my poetry collection, Postcolonial Banter. It's actually really short. That's one thing I'll say for anyone who's struggling to read, grab a poetry collection because they're really short. They're not long. And, people have said to me, I read this on my bus journey, right? I read this, half an hour just sitting, ready to go to bed. So I think always remember that there are different things we can read. Like not reading isn't always like a novel with 300 pages, right? And you'll get to the novel with 300 pages when you want to. So Postcolonial Banter is a poetry collection. What does that mean? It just means it's literally a collection of poems. These are poems that I've written over maybe the last 8 years. So some of them I wrote, feels a very long time ago. Some of them I wrote more recently. And, poetry, in some ways, is really difficult to publish. In other ways, is really easy. So it's difficult in the sense that, there's not a lot of money in publishing poetry. There's not a lot of presses that publish poetry. On the other hand, there are a lot of small presses that now exist, and there's a lot of self-publishing that goes on. I always am very wary that I don't want my words to be edited. I'm very concerned about being marketed as, tokenized basically as a Muslim woman, right? Like, here's another Muslim woman. She can do poetry. Oh my God. So for me, it was really important to find a really small, really independent press who don't have money to do marketing, right? Who don't have money for any of that stuff. And so Verve Poetry Press, actually, I came in contact with them first because they published the anthology that I mentioned, the one with the girls from Fly. And they were really good about that because they didn't ask us to change things. When we'd asked a few other publishers, they'd sort of said, oh, could you include this in it? Could you make it a bit more about this? And they were things we weren't interested in doing. So when I sort of saw their ethos, I felt like that was the right place. And they asked me, do you have more poems that you'd like to publish? And I would encourage everybody, if you feel like if you feel like your work should be published, I would say first off, share it, right? Like share it with people. So have your friends read it. Do they think it's good? Like, what recommendations can they give you? What feedback can they give you? If you, want to make your poetry, kind of do readings of it, go read it, read it to people, go to places to read it to people. There are many there's even many Muslim-led spoken word spaces these days. Or, set up an event if there's not, like reignite that history of poetry within Islam. Ask your masjid, can we have a kind of local, can we all come and read poetry or tell poetry? I got to do a brilliant poetry workshop at Lewisham Islamic Centre, my local masjid when I was living in Lewisham. And we had this brilliant showcase where all the young people kind of shared their poems, and it was really exciting. And I think it reminded people that they have things to say. So I would say if you feel that you want to publish, start doing that first, and then inshallah, you'll get the momentum to kind of realize, okay, these poems are good, and these ones maybe need a bit more work. Maybe that one isn't something I want to share. I don't know. You'll have those thought processes. So yeah, like I say, I didn't anticipate having a poetry collection published. It's so random. It seems really like a random thing to my 18-year-old self, but here I am. And I guess the one thing I will say about this is that, as I mentioned earlier about kind of wanting to educate as well through my work, I made a real effort, and I say in the introduction that there are these context boxes throughout the book. So I don't know if you can show you one, but there's sort of these they're like almost like footnotes, and at the bottom of a poem where I'm just trying to tell you a bit more about the context in which I've written these poems. And a lot of my poems are very political, right? It's called Postcolonial Banter. As we've already talked about, I'm very interested in how colonialism has shaped the world we live in today. And so the poems are about my life, right? They're about me going to school, or like me and my grandparents, or me kind of reading something in the newspaper and wondering about that, or me retorting to something that somebody said to me. But all of those things are also about the world we live in. So I have also kind of hoped and felt that when I've been able to share the poetry with people, it's also been a means of us just having those conversations you've mentioned as well, having these really bigger conversations about, okay, like if that's how you have analyzed your experience, how might we all analyze it? So yeah, sorry, I've got a bit tangential from what you asked me originally.
I'm going to be a little tricky and ask you if you could just read us one of your poems, if that's okay.
I can, yeah. Oh goodness, you've put me on the spot for
I have.
choice. I mean, I'll read you my favorite if that's all right. It's probably taking me a few minutes, but hopefully it's worth it. So this is called British Values, and the footnote kind of explains more about it, but I feel like it's one that kind of is relevant for all of us. Young Muslims in Britain often straddle two worlds. They appear to have a foot in each. Cultural concerns revealed around the national identification of Muslims in Britain. Review raises alarm over social integration in the UK. Schools to promote fundamental British values. The face of Britain is changing beyond recognition. I look in the mirror. It's not shattered. I am whole. No one foot in, one foot out. No reason I've got to learn Britishness from the somehow more devout. I'm not uneasy, torn, or straddling. It's not shattered. I am whole. Yet the opposite is somehow all that you'll get told. I mean, I guess because if we faced up to the glass, you'd be left with the fact that I am inside. I am Britain now. Because Britain is Bismillah, Britain is basmati rice, Britain is box braids and black barbers shops, Bollywood and Bhangra. Britain is Bradford and Barking and Birmingham, Britain is biryani and black beans, Britain is black, Britain is brown, Britain is boys blasting dubstep on the bus to town, Britain is body popping outside the tube, Britain is Brick Lane before it was cool, Britain is bilingual, Britain is the burqa, Britain is praying in the changing rooms, Britain has its feet in your sink, Britain is bad at knowing itself, belligerent and boring. Britain has not changed beyond recognition. Recognize it was never one thing. I am the inside you pretend is outside, but we have to stop pretending. Pretending the rolling hills are just romantic, not remnants of injustices swept under a rug. Like the tea didn't come from Asia, like its sugar wasn't grown by slaves, like dry humor isn't a way to just ridicule dissent, and cues don't expose the way we're always told to wait for change rather than making it. And it's funny that over-apologizing is seen as a national trait, because half of history is still waiting. I look in the mirror. It's not shattered, I am whole. There is no brink or turning point. Here, Britain is barbaric. Oh, sorry, did you think that was me? Barbaric bystander straddling the boundary, not quite inside. So you could say I'm the things you forgot, like you're modern, so I'm backwards. You're democratic, so you say I'm not. When the truth is, Britain is blood on its hands and back to the wall. Britain is selling weapons to the most repressive regimes in the world. Britain is the bombs the Saudis drop on Yemen. Britain is using fear to build surveillance apparatus since 9/11. Britain is believing in human rights whilst removing them all. Britain is Yarl's Wood, Brook House, Colnbrook and Morton Hall. Britain is 1,600 dead in or after police custody since 1990. Britain has no qualms about detaining asylum seekers indefinitely. Britain is suicide attempts, secret courts and secret torture. Britain is stopping you at the border. Britain is seeing it, saying it, sorting it, which means Britain is also deporting it. Because what else do you do when you look in the mirror and find the sugar and tea had strings attached? The factories on the rolling hills depended on our labor. The bombs destroyed the homes of kids now at the border. Britain is barbaric. Britain is blindly patriotic. Britain is built on false narratives, slices of other people's dishes. Britain is stolen artifacts in museums named after itself. Britain is knife and fork polite, stabbing you at will. Britain is selective. Yours till it's not, in yours till it's not, then blaming you. Britain is borders, Britain is Brexit, Britain is spending on weddings but not fireproofing homes, Britain is cutting mental health services yet somehow strong and stable, Britain is 40% of young people in custody being from ethnic minority backgrounds, and Britain is blaming them for this statistic rather than asking difficult questions, because Britain is blaming the kids who aren't white, Britain is blaming the Muslims, Britain is blaming the immigrants, Britain is blaming bureaucracy, Britain is not listening, Britain is not that great. Britain is breaking. We're breaking everywhere except the place it puts the blame, because there's only a few things left that are great about Britain. And they're that Britain is Bismillah, Basmati and bilingual, box braids and black barbers shops, Bollywood and Bhangra, body popping outside the tube, Brick Lane before it was cool. Britain is the burqa. Britain is praying in the changing rooms. Britain has its feet in your sink. Britain is your greatest nightmare, every repercussion you never thought through. Britain is the terror to be counted. Britain is the mind to be got inside. I am the great in Great Britain now, and aren't you terrified?
Okay. Thank you so much. Jazakallah khair. I think that goes back to a lot of the questions that in 2007 in the social political context were asking about what is British values, and it was defining this set of values, but showing at the end of the day that Britain is so diverse and plural, and that is so important to kind of understand that there's not one understanding of what it means to be British, and how people interpret values is very, very different. So for example, even with universities, I know we've had this conversation in terms of your own experience, but to do with reparations and the slave trade and the implications of that, and how important that is to acknowledge and to apologize. So thank you.
And even and even just the idea that, you know, as you mentioned, the idea, the contradiction that is British values, right? That it's British values of democracy, toleration. I mean, this is a country that's colonized, that's genocidal, that's stolen and exploited. So I think it's important also to just, you know, why do we even buy into, we shouldn't accept just the terms themselves, right? Like, what is British, what is values? And so, you know, I think that also comes back to the idea of language as well. Like, language is so important for us to play with.
I think what this brings me on to as well, I listened to one of your poems. I listened to quite a few, but it was a funeral of the authentic Muslim woman, and that actually made me cry, subhanAllah, because it was so profound in the sense that we're not one, and this is a failure that can happen many times. People perceive Muslims generally as one community, but we are communities, but also Muslim women. We're so diverse, we're so different and dynamic in all our different ways. And it's about acknowledging that, embracing that, but also letting people know that we are unashamedly a Muslim woman and we're proud of that. So even our own journeys of how we've come towards Islam and our, you know, kind of the process of wearing hijab, that's something that's so personal to every individual as well. So yeah, thank you.
No, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that.
No, honestly, subhanAllah, that was one that, because, you know, there's a lot of discussions within kind of academia around intersectionality. And, you know, when we think of Muslim women, there is this danger that people fall into, that we're kind of oppressed and don't make our own life choices, and that we're limited in what we do. And it's about, you know, kind of challenging that constantly, be it through our actions as Muslims. And the core of it is that we're inspired by our deen to be who we are. but also
Yeah.
like we have all these otherized identities, which is problematic, and it relates to this kind of idea of who is the ideal British citizen, for example, so the citizenship test. And I think in one of your talks you spoke about kind of identifying, not necessarily, we have multiple identities, but the soul and your relationship with Allah, and that comes before anything. And I think that's so important to kind of express that and communicate to people when you're interacting with them as well, that our faith,
Yeah.
our religiosity is at the top of our kind of priority, but
Yeah.
everything is dictated by that then. So our
Yeah,
ultimate,
exactly.
everything we do is for the sake of Allah, and it's comes from the core of having the deen. So
Yeah. Can I just add really quickly to that? Sorry.
go
Just,
for it.
I just wanted to add, because I think sometimes when we, this idea that, yeah, as you say, Muslim women are perceived to be oppressed and blah, blah, blah. But I think also it's important to, we don't have to spend all our time challenging that as well. Like, we can challenge it if we want to, but I think, I love this quote. I always quote it. Toni Morrison said that one of the functions of racism is distraction, that they will say you have no history, so you spend 20 years proving that you do. They'll say your skulls are too small, so you spend 20 years proving that they're not, and there will always be one more thing. And I think that just really transformed my life when I read it, several years ago now. But because, I realized for so long my work, my poetry, my writing, whatever it was all really just about disproving what somebody else thought about me. And what I realized is that, if I was disproving stereotypes all the time, wasn't I also just kind of relying on those stereotypes and kind of perpetuating them? So I think, I don't blame any of us, because I think we're so forced to do it. We're so told that that's the most important thing you can do as a Muslim woman, is to break stereotypes. And I kind of feel like, stereotypes aren't there to be broken. They're there to break us. And I just want to encourage people as well to remember that you don't have to just keep proving yourselves, because I don't think there will come a time where you've proven it, right? Like, we can be as loud and as, confident and XYZ as we want to be, but that's not going to kind of be the thing that ends racism. So yeah, I just wanted to add that, because I think it's something that I believed for so long, and it's something that I now think, oh gosh, like, I'm not wasting my time doing that anymore.
You had put together an essay in Dr. Qureshi's book, I Refuse to Condemn. And I wanted to ask you about that. That also kind of interlinks and interrelates to postcolonial banter in an essence, really. So yeah, if you could tell us a little about the essay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've got the book here, just because I thought I would also bring it up. I Refuse to Condemn is the name of the book. And it's a really brilliant collection. Like, mashallah, I really recommend.
For the viewers, so they can see. Yeah. And your other book, your Postcolonial Banter. I'm plugging here for you. Okay, inshallah. Okay.
So yeah, so this collection I really, really recommend. And if whether or not I was in it, or I just think it's such a brilliant and important reminder for Muslims, really. And I think it really primarily is for Muslims. The idea behind I Refuse to Condemn is really the idea that it kind of links to what we were just talking about, right? That for so many of us, we are always actually responding to these demands upon us to, prove you're not oppressed, prove you're not submissive, prove you're independent. But as Muslims more generally, not just Muslim women, also, prove you're not a terrorist. That is the number one, right? Prove that you don't, condone terrorism. And, we have really obvious examples of that. Many of the people in the book, they have been in interviews, for example, news interviews, where they're talking about something completely different. And then they're asked, well, what do you feel about terrorism? And that question itself always suggests, obviously, that, we're presumed to support it, right? There's no idea that, like, well, why, hang on, why are you even asking me this? But some of us, like in my essay, I'm not talking about having been specifically asked to condemn terrorism, but a more general kind of, what is the impact of living in a society where you are always seen as automatically suspicious, automatically linked to violence? We have we have laws like the Prevent Duty that automatically associate Muslim people with threat, with suspicion. Ask all teachers, all doctors, all nurses, all healthcare staff to treat us in that way. And so I'm kind of exploring, my essay is called, Is This Radical? Am I Radical? Because I'm really asking, if I'm already presumed to be radical, then I don't care about disproving that. I'm not going to spend all my life disproving that. And actually, I'm more interested in asking who benefits when that question is asked. When you ask, do you condemn terrorism? What power dynamic is actually hiding behind that? And so that's what I focus on. I'm interested in seeing well, let's stop for a second. What are the presumptions here, and what do those presumptions uphold? So in the case of, do you condemn terrorism or not? Like, are you a terrorist or not? It's less interesting to think about my answer and more interesting to think, what does the person who's asking that presume, and what is their worldview, and how does their worldview allow people like me to be oppressed? So yeah, so that's my essay. But honestly, there's much more interesting essays in there. I really, really recommend it. I feel like it's so. I kind of hate the word empowering, but it is so empowering. It really reminds you of what we're here for, like we were talking about earlier, what we're really here for. And it's not to kind of go back and forth and like, yes, I'm a terrorist, no, I'm not a terrorist, yes, no, I'm not. It's to do so much more than that. And I think, I'm really proud to have been asked by Dr. Qureshi to be part of the anthology. And I think, mashallah, it really, really is something that I feel will really change a lot of people's lives. And just even the ways we think about ourselves, because more than anything, I think Islamophobia and the war on terror, I think more than anything, there's so much violence it has caused, but I think our own psyches have been really mutated by it. The ways we think about ourselves have been so damaged, and we don't think of ourselves as human. We think of ourselves as suspect, and to prove ourselves not to be suspect. And we limit what Islam is for ourselves. We limit our relationship to Islam because we're spending all our time trying to defend Islam from the racists, not actually having a chance to just say, how is my relationship with Islam? What is this religion? Do I even understand this religion? And I think it's a real tragedy. It's not our fault, but it's a real tragedy. And it's something that, I pray Allah aids us out of this situation.
I think there's a lot of things here that we're speaking about regarding social conditioning as well. So I think that has a huge impact. And just having a reminder that our purpose here is to worship Allah, and continuously having a sense of sisterhood, brotherhood, to kind of reminding benefits believers, inshallah. So one of the last questions I have is to do with so we live in a time where there is, and we acknowledge that there is Islamophobia. So there are younger people that are listening, and they're in this context and they're growing up in this context. What advice would you give to them?
Oh, there's lots of different advice I could give. I think that one of the most important pieces of advice I would give is to not pretend it's not there, right? I think sometimes we think that Islamophobia is something to be overcome. It's like, how do you rise above it? How do you ignore the obstacles? How do you just get to your goal? I would say the opposite. I would say, number one, if you're a young person, let me tell you, Islamophobia is real. You are experiencing it. And just even that validation, I think, is so important for us to say to one another, yes, there is this historical and political construction of you as a threat, as a danger, as a suspect. And I don't think it's painful for us to tell each other that, because we already know that, right? It's actually really important and empowering to articulate what that is. I would also say to young people, educate ourselves. Let's all learn about this thing, right? Because Islamophobia is not actually something unique. It's not something completely new. It is rooted in a wider history. And I think Muslims, we don't learn about white supremacy more broadly. We don't learn about colonialism, as you already mentioned, at school. We learn about capitalism. But I think the world that we live in today was made over the past 500 years, really, through all these things. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that, because that then also empowers us. It makes us feel that, it's not inevitable that Islamophobia exists. It's actually a historical construct. It was made through a series of ideas and power dynamics. And if that's the case, we can resist it. And then that's the third thing I would say to young people is to resist Islamophobia. Now, what does that mean? What does that look like? I don't just mean, okay, what we should do is break stereotypes, as we talked about. I also don't just mean, we need to put forward more positive representation, because what I said about let's learn more about, Islamophobia and racism is that when we learn what racism actually is, we understand that it won't be ended by positive representation. It won't be ended by more Muslims becoming, police officers or MPs or anything. What ending Islamophobia includes also ending, the violence of the hostile environment, the violence of policing in general that harms all our Black brothers and sisters, whether they're Muslim or not, that has harmed them for so long. It also includes ending, the relationship that the global North has with the global South. So whether that's where do we buy our clothes and who is exploiting sweatshops, making them for us, all these things are linked, right? You can't just end Islamophobia and everything be fine, because actually Islamophobia can't be ended unless all those oppressive things are ended. So when I say that we should resist Islamophobia, what I'm really saying is we need to educate ourselves, but as a collective, and we need to build really strong connections and links with all oppressed and marginalized people across the world and within our own communities, right? I think we mustn't fall into the trap of like, I'm a Muslim, I only work with Muslims to oppose Islamophobia. Actually, when you realize Islamophobia is linked to these other things, we need to be arm in arm with, asylum seekers, undocumented people, immigrants, all people of color, everybody who's kind of victim to the state, people being deported, people being detained, people who, are kind of being exploited in working conditions because they don't have a citizenship. We mustn't fall into the trap of replicating the kind of oppression we face. So we mustn't be xenophobic. We mustn't be, saying, oh, they're an illegal immigrant. I mean, who cares? What is illegal? Illegal is a category that the government has made up to say these people don't deserve rights. Any of us can be made illegal. Our citizenship can be stripped. We've seen what happened to Shamima Begum. That's not something that only happens to her because she left this country. It happened because she's a person of color. She's a Muslim. It could happen to any of us. So the reason I say all of that, some people would say, oh, you mustn't say to young people all of this. It's so, you've got to just tell them to look past it. I say no. I say that, Allah's put us in this world at this time. I really, truly, sincerely believe that if, the Prophet ﷺ, if the Sahaba were alive today, they wouldn't turn a blind eye. They wouldn't say, let's ignore. They would say, this is actually one of the biggest issues of our times, right? And we must, as Muslims, we have to resist injustices wherever we see them. We know the hadith, resist with your hands. If you can't with your hands, with your tongue. If you can't with your heart, where are we in that list, right? Let's begin with our hearts at least. If we can learn and educate ourselves, then we can educate others. So then with our tongue, we resist. And, inshallah, with our hands, we can also resist, whether that looks like building communities, whether it looks like, being together and helping one another. I think that also gives us purpose. And I think as a young person, more than ever right now, we need purpose, and we need to understand, how does my purpose of worshiping Allah, being alive for that purpose, match up with the fact that, I have to go to school every day, I go to madrasa, I, have to have dinner, maybe I play football, maybe I read book, how do these two things go together? And I think that is the thing that helps, is that in all segments of our life, we should be resisting injustice. And that is really, it turns Islamophobia into this thing that harms and is an obstacle to instead becoming something that actually we are in charge of, removing. And in removing it, we have to remove all oppressive structures. And I really believe, Allah put us on earth as vicegerents, right? As these kind of gatekeepers and these protectors of the earth. And if we're saying, oh, I'm just going to ignore the problems and just, I just want to pursue my career, then are we doing enough? Allahu Alam, I don't know. And I dare not judge anybody else in their pursuits, but I think it's something serious for us to think about. And, inshallah, if we all came, imagine if every Muslim in this country was really like, we're going to do this, we really care, that would be revolutionary.
I was just saying that it's so important to be ambassadors of Islam, but what's also important, and that I'm just picked up on what you've been mentioning, is division and this idea of them versus us, which is created in these little silos, which is really, really toxic. And the main aim of people coming together as a collective to fight injustices wherever they are is really, really important. So yeah, Jazakallah khair. So my dear sister, may Allah reward you and reward you with these that are heavy on the day of judgment, inshallah, and the scale, and continue to do as you do and inspire lots of many people, and including myself. So I want to thank you, Jazakallah khair, for your time on behalf of ILS, and
wonderful opportunity.
It's really, really engaging and powerful. So thank you so much. Okay, thank you to everyone who's been listening. Assalamu alaikum.